Tonight we are in lesson 24. Lesson 24 about the Maccabean Revolt and the independent Jewish state that they had for about a century, round number, in the Intertestament period. So we're in the Intertestament times, coming near to the conclusion of this study, in the time where the revelation of the Old Testament history concluded. We found that we needed to study after the end of the Persian period, which was in place when the Old Testament concluded. There was the Greek invasion that was coming and was prophesied by name by Daniel, and Daniel spoke a lot about it. And we studied in Daniel 9, 11, 12, Daniel 8 as well. So we studied a lot of it in Daniel. And then we had the Greek time coming, which was also prophesied in the abomination of desolations and those prophecies which we looked at before. And then as we finish that, we've come now to the Maccabean Revolt, what the oppression that Daniel foresaw, the oppression led directly to revolt. So we studied it as a matter of prophecy, and now we're looking at it as a matter of history and the resulting independent Jewish state, of which there's not just a lot said in prophecy, but it is an important thing for New Testament introduction. And then we'll see after that Jewish state was in existence for a while, then the Romans came, and the Romans installed Herod as ruler. So we'll talk about Romans and Herod, which we certainly are familiar with from New Testament times. So we'll look at how they came to be in such an important place, and that Jewish hope that they had based on this period we studied tonight, which helps explain the Zealots and helps explain why we sometimes wonder, why did the Jews think they could rebel against the Romans and get away with it? What did they hope to accomplish? We'll look at that, and we'll see the things that lead up to the destruction of Jewish culture, the destruction of the whole Levitical system, and the people of God as a physical people living in a physical land, why that came to be. So last week we looked at the key points for this lesson. We'll review it because we didn't get that far into this lesson, and we had several gone. So we talked about the oppression and the persecution that lead to revolt. We've talked about this some, again, especially in Daniel 11, by prophecy. Now we look at it as history. The self-rule and the success that the Jews had, how that led to its own set of problems. And so is oftentimes once the oppressed are freed, in some ways they often become the oppressor. And the Jewish kingdom did at least some of that. And we had this 100 years of independence, which ends with the Romans coming. So we're in history, as we mentioned, the Maccabean Revolt, that's the oppression that leads to revolt. These things were prophesied. We'll just very quickly mention in Daniel 8 by way of review that there was a little horn that was coming, and he was going to end the regular burnt offering. That would be taken away, and it said that would be taken away because of transgression. One of the interesting things in Daniel 8 is which transgression? Is it the transgression to take it away, or was the transgression on the part of the Jews and their unfaithfulness? So God took it away. And so whose transgression is it when it says the offering is ended because of transgression? But the offering would be ended, and it said in Daniel 8, there was a vision about the regular burnt offering and transgression that makes desolate. And there was a giving over the sanctuary to be trampled underfoot. It said it would be for 2,300 evenings and mornings. So we take that as 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices that were missed in the time when the Greeks controlled the sanctuary. They set up the idolatry in the temple courtyard. They set up priests for Zeus to worship there, and the rites that were given and required in the law of Moses, those were forbidden. And so that happened for a period of about 3.5 years, which ends up working out to be almost exactly, by historic record, the 2,300 evenings and mornings. So if we were going to guess exactly how long it is, I'd go with the prophecy. And so these problems were prophesied again. Daniel 11 said that the contemptible one would come, and there was a blow-by-blow account of all these things coming, and then the ruler that all of those prophecies would lead up to is the one we know as Antiochus IV. He's called a despised, despicable, or contemptible person. It said he would appear and profane the temple and the fortress. He would take away the regular burnt offerings. He would set up the abomination that makes desolate. And so in the New Testament, we know when Jesus refers to that in Matthew 24 as the abomination of desolations. So that set of hardships, that really beyond the normal amount of persecution, it's quite regular that there is in the Old Testament an antipathy between the Jews and their neighbors, that the Samaritans, their best interest is never for the temple in Jerusalem, is it? They got their own temple up in Gerizim, and they caused problems in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, and there was always some kinds of issues between one another. There was the remnants of the Edomites who will become known by a slightly different name as Idumeans, so from Edom to Idumea, by the Latin name for the place. They are not real friendly to the Jews. There's a remnant of the Philistine people. They're not exactly Philistines. By the time we get this far down, they've intermixed and intermarried with others. And their interest often is toward the sea. And they're connected with Tyre and Sidon and Carthage, of all places. And so there's that pagan outpost in what we would know, from the early period of Bible times or the early period of the kingdoms of the Jews as the Philistines. There's that outpost. There's always some antipathy. There's always some controversy. But this oppression of the outlawing of circumcision, the outlawing of Sabbath keeping, the stopping of the sacrifices that Antiochus did, this was something that really was just beyond the normal situation of persecution. And as we talked about last time in the last lesson, the great impact of Hellenistic culture and many Jews Hellenizing themselves, they didn't seem to mind so much becoming like the Greek culture around them, but to make illegal every remnant of Judaism, that was too much for most folks. And it was certainly way too much for the religious people. And so it got to be where they said, there's just no more, there's no more of this that we can take. And so there was a persecution of those who tried to follow the law. And in the book of 1 Maccabees, which is a book that probably we've at least heard of, even if maybe we haven't read it, in the book of 1 Maccabees, there's an account that just reads like real history, because the book of Maccabees is a book of historical telling of things, as is 2 Maccabees. Those books are a record of the Jewish people in this time of the intertestament period. It was included, these books, in the Septuagint translation. For those churches today that accept the Apocrypha, or sometimes it's called the deuterocanonical books, which means second to the standard. It's the books that most of us don't accept. But those books were part of the Septuagint. Those books do record a history. And so in the history, and we have at the back of this lesson an addendum where we have a couple of rather brief excerpts, but it tells us how the Maccabean revolt began. And it's the second excerpt there on page 103 of your guide. And we just briefly look at it. Partly we'll see as we read this, we'll see it's not quite the way the scriptures record things, because it's not quite the scriptures. But it does certainly read like a realistic history of events by people who knew things. So 1 Maccabees, the second chapter, it says, "The officers of the kings in charge of enforcing the apostasy came to the city of Modian, and there to make sacrifice. The officers addressed Matthias, he was an old priest, and they said to him, 'You are a leader, an honorable man, and a great man in this city, supported by sons and kindred. Come now, be the first to obey the king's command, as all the Gentiles and the Judeans and those who were left from Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the king's friends, and you and your sons shall be honored with silver and gold and many gifts.'" So come on, help us out here. You're an important man here in the village. You're an important man in the city. We'll honor you. You can be our friend if you just lead the worship. But Matthias answered in a loud voice, although all the Gentiles in the king's realm obey him, so that they forsake the religion of their ancestors and consent to the king's orders, yet I and my sons and my kindred will keep the covenant of our ancestors. Heaven forbid that we should forsake the law and the commandments. We will not obey the words of the king by departing from our religion in the slightest degree. And so then they got another fella, and he said, well, I'll just take up the sacrifice, and I'll offer the sacrifice. And while Matthias and the rest of them looked on, he walked up to the altar that was made to make the sacrifice. And so Matthias killed the guy. And then in the uproar that followed, it says, the story continues, he also killed the messengers of the king who were forcing them to forsake the sacrifice, and they tore down the altar. Thus he showed his zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did with Zimri, the son of Salu. Then Matthias cried out to the city, let everyone who is zealous for the law and who stands for the covenant follow me. Then he and his sons fled to the mountains, leaving behind in the city all their possessions. So that is the record of the beginning of the Maccabean revolt. That Matthias, that he said, we're not going to do that. And they killed the fellows who had been sent out to tell them to do that. Now, as you just read that, and I don't know if you've read that before, that's the first time you ever heard it. I mean, that just sounds like a telling of history, doesn't it? Now, from the ancient world, it's a pretty clear and concise history. It's a better history than most of the things I've read from the ancient world. But it also, at the same time, that doesn't quite sound like scriptures, does it? At least it does not to me sound like the scriptures. And that's what I feel. The more I read the First Maccabees, and I've read that, and Second Maccabees, is you read those historical books, you find them, I think, to be a good history and of these things, a reliable history, and to understand what it was that people were doing and why. And one thing we definitely know about these books of the Maccabees, since that they were included in the Septuagint translation of Scripture, which was, by all accounts, one of the best-selling books of the ancient world, that the Jews everywhere in the generations to follow, this is how they viewed these events, and this is how they formed their opinion based on what these books said. So as intellectual history, it's also quite important. So the Apocrypha, and we might just mention briefly, I don't think we'll have a whole section on the Apocrypha, or today the scholars will call it the deuterocanonical books. Basically, Apocrypha, I mean, what does Apocrypha mean? Anybody? Basically, its short answer is it has the idea of it's not inspired, it's not, it almost comes, it has a connotation of something that's fake or that's added later. And so if we ever say about a thing it's apocryphal, does that sound like a compliment? Certainly not. But there is some value in the books called the Apocrypha. As I say, today, if somebody's scholarly, you'll hear instead these books described as deuterocanonical, which is a really, that's a big $50 word. And what that word means is it's second to the standard. So like the book of Deuteronomy, what's Deuteronomy mean? It's second law. Deutero, from the same root we get the word duet. It's a second reading of the law is Deuteronomy. The canon, Matt, if we say it's part of the canon or it's canonical, what do we mean by it's in the canon? Right, it's part of the accepted standard, right? So when we talk about the Bible, how will we describe the Bible as a whole? That's the canon, right? And if something's in the Bible, the description of it is it's canonical. So it's the accepted standard of things. So deuterocanonical means things that are second to the standard. So they aren't the standard. Now, there are some churches though that accept parts of these things as legitimate to the standard, and they accept them with the standard. And so in Catholic versions of the Bible, you will find these apocryphal, or again, second books. There's a couple of points of doctrine that the Catholics prove from these books. And every one of those doctrines are things that Protestants reject entirely. There's a smaller subset of these things that the Greek Orthodox Church accepts as standard books. I think the Protestant position is right, that none of these are standard books. But at the same time, even though it's not a standard book, it's still, it's worth knowing. And also it shapes people's thinking. So when people say, there's some things that people say or refer to, and to know that where they get that might be helpful. In some ways, it's not exactly the same, but it might be something comparable to the English Book of Common Prayer. How many of us use the English Book of Common Prayer? Right. So if you had a traditional wedding ceremony, chances are about half the words that everybody recognized from the wedding ceremony came from I think it's 1552 or 1554. It's one of those 1550s. The Book of Common Prayer. There's also a lot of language we use at funerals today. Even Protestants use at funerals, and it's right out of the Book of Common Prayer. And so the Book of Common Prayer isn't our standard. It isn't our guide. There's nothing authoritative about the Book of Common Prayer. Yet at the same time, it is such an influential book in the history of English-speaking Christianity that to know the book is generally helpful. And there are some great things in the book that are helpful, even though it's not inspired. And so the Apocrypha, and this is my copy, it's my only copy. Well, one time I was cleaning out my car. I think I've told you the story. One time I was cleaning out my car, and I found 4 Bibles and 5 first aid kits. Because every time you go camping with the Scouts, what are you supposed to take? A first aid kit. And what kept getting put in my car? More and more Bibles. And so at one time in my car, I literally found 4 Bibles and 5 first aid kits. Well, how many copies of the Apocrypha, if you search my office high and low, don't do that unless you're there to clean. It would be helpful if somebody would do that for me. But if you search my Bible, if you search my office high and low, how many copies of this you think you'd find? It is on the same shelf as I actually have more Book of Mormons than this, because they gave those away for a long time. So that's my only copy. It's helpful to have. It's helpful to know. I think it's good to know what's in the Apocrypha. And I do myself certainly count the first and second book of Maccabees. There's 4 of them in all. I count those 2 books as a reliable ancient history. Not inspired, but a reliable ancient history. And don't we all have some history textbooks that we turn to look at things and know, this is what happened and here's the record. So just like we'd use a book of history, the first and second book of Maccabees are important books to know. Also, as I say, they are important to know because they shape people's beliefs for a long time. And all the Jews knew these books. In 2nd Maccabees, there is one other thing that's probably important to know, is there's a story in 2nd Maccabees about a group of soldiers who, I think it was 24 or so of them. They're all killed in battle, and people find their bodies after the battle, and they're dressing them for burial and preparation for burial. And they find on every one of those soldiers, I guess they were all friends, or they were the same unit. They found on every single one of those soldiers, they found them some kind of pagan totem. They found a little pagan idol on all of them, kind of, something like any of y'all ever carried a rabbit's foot? Yeah, me either. But when I was a kid, it was kind of a big, people had lucky rabbit's foot and rabbit foot keychains and the like. But these, back in those days with active paganism, when they carry these totems, it's something quite a bit, more than just a good luck charm. And so it's relying on these pagan deities as protectors and the like. And so what do you do, and what do you think about these Jewish men who die fighting against the oppressors who are forbidding the law? They're dying for the sake of, well, what was it Matthias said? He's recorded as saying, Let everyone who's zealous for the law and who stands for the covenant follow me, right? And so this is a war for the law and the covenant. And then you find a group of soldiers who die in the war for the law and the covenant, and they've all got a pagan thing on them. What do? You just go, well, that's unfortunate. What they did is that they took up a collection among the locals who were burying these bodies. They took up a collection among the locals, and they sent down to a place where they were going to do sacrifices, and they were going to offer sacrifices on behalf of these dead soldiers. Now, we might ask, how much would that help? Yeah, I think it'd be just about as effective. All right, well, I think that's an accurate record of what the people actually did. But from that historical incident, the Catholics they use this verse as a support for the idea of prayers for the dead. Sometimes the doctrine of purgatory, when there have been debates and they've been writing about the doctrines of purgatory, that is one of the incidents that shows up. And so it is there. It's an old thing. But again, that's where we wouldn't, one, you'd have to, in order to use that as a proof of anything, you'd first have to say that that was an approved action, which the Maccabees record just says it is an action. It did happen. But you'd have to prove that it was an approved action by the author. And then you'd also have to say that the author was authoritative in what he approved. And I think both of those tests comes up short. In any case, knowing some facts about the history is helpful. Also, in the first Maccabees, there is the story of them reclaiming the temple from the Greeks, and they had very little of the ceremonial oil that hadn't been polluted, and so they lit the menorah, the candlestick with 7 parts. They lit the menorah in the temple, and supposedly, how long did the menorah, the oil? Again, they just found one little jar that was acceptable for use in temple use of unpolluted oil. And according to the Hanukkah story, how long did the candle stay lit? Yeah. So it's 7 days. Stays lit for, according to the story, it stays lit for 7 days, and that is or 8 even. It's from Sabbath to Sabbath, and so that is the origin of the feast of Hanukkah, and that's also in Maccabees. Now, question about that. That would obviously be a miracle for a little jar of oil to last that long, would it not? To burn for that many days. Do we think that happened? Or was that just a fanciful thing? Or do we have to decide? Do we even need an opinion on it? Was God doing miracles in those days? Right, there's none recorded in Scripture because there's no Scripture recorded in this period, right? And so in that intertestament period, was God active in his providential actions? Well, certainly. These things are matters of prophecy, and God made sure that these occurred. Did God work miracles? I don't know. There is a record that seems to be generally reliable that in this period that says he did. The Hebrew writer said that God used to speak to the fathers in many ways and in many portions. That's Hebrews 1:1. So could such a thing have happened? I think absolutely it could have happened. Did it happen? I haven't a clue. I don't know. But in any case, we do know the Jews thought it did, and they have taken that as an authoritative count ever since. The Feast of Dedication is mentioned in the New Testament, yes. We know it as Hanukkah mostly. It's also called the Feast or Festival of Lights, which I think may be what Hanukkah means in English. But it is referred to in the New Testament as the Feast of Dedication. Yes. So we have 2 feasts that come up not from Mosaic times, but come afterwards. The book of Esther tells us a story that leads to the observance of Purim, the Feast of Purim, which is observed to this day. And there in the Maccabees, first and second Maccabees, is the story of the rededication of the temple, where the oil burns for a week, and that leads to the commemoration of that with the Feast of Dedication. Yeah, so 180 years, round number. The Jews are keeping that in the time of Jesus, and Jesus does go to that feast to teach the people. There is a record, I think it's in second Maccabees, of one of the Jewish leaders attacking on the Sabbath. Yes.
During this time frame that the Maccabees convinced people that they could fight on the Sabbath, that it would not be a violation of the law.
Yes, the Maccabees argued that they could do that. If you're being slaughtered on the Sabbath, what would you do? There are several very practical things that that this Maccabee family puts in place that work out for the Jews. So that is one of the things. There was a record of them being attacked on the Sabbath. I think I've read that that's the first time in history that we had a case of people making it a point to attack the Jews on the Sabbath day. Was during this period, and that's how they responded by saying, "Okay, well, if you're gonna do that, we're gonna fight. We'll at least defend ourselves on the Sabbath." So, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing. Not that a lot of this is a little bit at least confusing. We often as Christians refer to these folks as the Maccabees. And I think these 4 books of Maccabees, the other 2 books of Maccabees in the Apocrypha, I know it's supposed to be deuterocanonical, but anyway, I grew up knowing it as the Apocrypha. The other 2 books are not historical books. The third one tells a story of something that happened long before, tells about an atrocity down in Egypt. And then the fourth one is it uses a terrible incident, because there's a lot of atrocities. It is a discussion about good and evil and reason and faith. So they're not really historical books, and most people today don't pay much attention to them. I lost my train of thought as to where it's going. All right, so I totally lost my own train of thought there. So we've got this civil war. Oh, I know what it was. I know what I was talking about. We call them the Maccabees. So there was only one guy who actually was called Maccabee. The old man was named Matthias, the old priest. He dies pretty early on in the war. Well, war is not for old guys. It's just not. His son, Judas, was a very effective leader, and he's called Judas Maccabee, or Judas the Hammer. And so, and I guess I got to say, if you're ever going to give, if you're going to get a historical nickname, the Hammer's a pretty good one to get, right? There's a couple of times in history where people are called the Hammer. It's also going to be my wrestling name when I go into pro wrestling. I'll be the Hammer. So Judas is the Hammer, but Judas doesn't survive the war either. Matthias had, I think it's 4 or 5 sons. Several of them die in the war, but they end up winning the war, and they end up becoming Matthias's sons and grandsons. End up becoming the leading family of all Israel. They were priests from that kind of small town, but they led the revolt. And if you're the winners of a war, what do you get to be when it's over? You get to be the leader of the country oftentimes. And so this family dynasty, descended of Matthias, the priest, Judas was one. Judas was, for most of them, an uncle or a brother. This family becomes the leaders, and they set up a dynasty in Jerusalem, and they become known as the Hasmoneans. So it's like, could we just have one name? So, Hasmoneus, I think, he was one of the patriarchs of the family before Matthias. So he was a guy of total obscurity, but the dynasty that comes through Matthias is named for Matthias' dad or granddad. I forget which one it was. So this obscure man, Hasmoneus, that's the name of the dynasty of his descendants who rule in Jerusalem as the kings in the future. First, they're not quite called kings. Some of it is like in English royalty. Sometimes there's a guy who rules a country, but he's not a king, so he gets to be a duke. But the duke is the ruler of the country, and eventually his descendants might be the king. There's some of that in this. It takes a while before one of them is actually called a king, but we'll just call them all the king, even though they don't technically wear that title. One of them is an ethnarch for a while, and other ancient titles that mean nothing to us. So they establish this kingdom, this independent kingdom, and they take over Jerusalem pretty quickly. But it's sort of like the American Civil War. Not Civil War, the American Revolutionary War. If we're students of American history, when does the American War of Independence, when does our Revolutionary War end? Because we have a big date in mind for the Revolutionary War, and what's that? 1776, right? But when does the war end? Yeah, it's 80. Well, the Constitution's is in 1787. I think it's 1780 or 1782 or 1784. It takes a while, right? It takes a while, and it'd be nice if we had a history teacher here. Oh, I have a history degree. I don't remember. It's not that big a deal. 83. Okay, we hit everywhere around it. If we were playing horseshoes, Ben and I would have been a good team. We landed all the way around the pole. All right, so we've got from 1776, when we declare independence, till it's 7 years of war. And if you're studying that period, you've got cities that are under control of the British for a while, then under control of the Americans for a while, then under control of the British again, and back and forth and back. And it gets all kind of confusing, and it's just easier to watch Hamilton on Disney and be done with it, right? So we don't care about all these details. Well, that's how this goes on for several years. There are 7 or 8 or 10 years that after, we normally talk about the revolt being like 3 years, because from the time that Matthias kills the guy with the sacrifice until they, take Jerusalem and restore the temple and do all that, it's a pretty short period of time, just a couple of years. But then the Greeks don't give it up that easily. They keep trying to invade, and so slowly, Jewish authority extends further and further and further. And so it starts off where basically they just control for a year or so, or a couple of years, about as far from the walls of Jerusalem as you can see. Because once you go over the horizon, who knows what's going on. But slowly, there we are. Slowly, and it starts with that center block right around Jerusalem. Over the next 30 years, the Jewish kingdom just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And they end up controlling almost as much land as Solomon did. And so they conquer what used to be Edom, the Idumeans. They conquer all of Samaria, because a lot of the Samaritans at first were siding with the Gentiles, siding with the Greeks, because they didn't like the Jews that much. Well, once the Jews conquer Samaria, how do you think they treated them? Yeah, they forced them all to be circumcised, and they tore down the temple at Mount Gerizim. That's how they treated them. And then they conquer Galilee, where a whole bunch of Jews were. And then they conquer up the coast, and they conquer the other side of the river. And all this, if you look at that this same map in New Testament times, you see it's divided up into all these little pieces and parts. Well, over the next 40 years, this Jewish dynasty, this Hasmonean kingdom, they not only, gain independence for themselves to follow the law and reestablish the sacrifices and reestablish kind of an Old Testament type system. Again, it's still got a lot of this Greek influence in it, but they established this Old Testament type system again throughout this whole region, and they have about 100 years of independence. The first rulers were sons of Matthias, Jonathan, and Simon. And then the grandson, on page 101, we have our chart there of the Hasmonean dynasty. John Hyrcanus, who is the grandson of Matthias, the nephew of Judas Maccabee. He rules for 30 years, and he conquers, half of that up there. He conquered an awful lot of it. And it took them 30 years to get rid of the rule from Damascus entirely. But he was able to make them a truly independent kingdom. So one that's not threatened, one that's going to be secure, and then his son and grandson rule. And then they had a terrible civil war where they started killing, the brothers started killing each other in the dynasty. And there was a 10-year period where one of the wives was the regent of the kingdom. And then we had a couple more years to go. So you have this 100 years, and in this 100 years of independence, it's mostly successful, but not entirely. And Steve mentioned this, hey, let's go ahead and fight on the Sabbath. Let's not disadvantage ourselves. There are shortcuts that, just in the name of practicality, the Jewish rulers said that we needed to do. And the other thing they did, and we'll think about this for next week. So this family of priests has set themselves up to be the king, and in a dynastic situation where the ruler, the kingship is passed, from one of these families to the next. But they also say, we're going to be the high priest. Because the high priest, under the influence of that Hellenistic culture, the prior high priest had compromised with the Greek rulers. And he had gone along with a lot of what the Greeks had said, including, just complete rebellion and lack of obedience to Jehovah God and fidelity to the one true God of Israel. And so this family of priests said, get out of here. And instead of when they got in charge, instead of putting one of his descendants back on into the role of high priest, they said, we'll just take care of that ourselves. And so we have this new family ruling this ever-increasing kingdom for a good while. And they say, don't worry, we'll be the kings. And don't worry, we'll be the priest. Y'all just sit back and pay your tithes, it'll all be good. So how do you think that would go over? So that'll be the next time. And sometimes we think about these in the gospel age. Again, we're basically New Testament introductioning here. In the gospel age, we think about some of these really corrupt priests and how these priests are making decisions that don't seem spiritual at all. Well, they had a couple 100-year history of that by this point, don't they? And so this power that they have in independence, this becomes in some ways a great boon to Jewish society, but in other ways, in some spiritual things, it becomes a great stumbling block. All right, so that'll be next time as we talk about the development of Sadducees and the development of Pharisees under this independent kingdom system.